what you paid for that heifer to either develop her or buy her as a bred heifer, and then what you're going to get out of her having to sell her as a weigh up because she didn't come up with that second calf. That's a substantial loss to our operation.
That's Karla Wilke, Beef Extension Specialist with the University of Nebraska, joining us today as we go through several discussion points regarding getting that elusive second calf out of that first calf heifer. Now, some would say don't baby the girl, but there could be some flaws in that theory.
So on the one hand is that we say we're not babying her, but you're sure not babying her, but you're also not even meeting her needs. So you're not setting her up for success. You're setting her up for failure and then blaming her.
And what about the genetics we're breeding into our herd? How it should relate to our physical environment?
We also need to be careful in that we don't end up creating a cow that has too big of a maintenance requirement, too big of a cow for the environment that we're in, has too much milk production.
It's that elusive second calf we all want, yet it's a balance between too much and not enough, because in either direction, we'll have a huge loss in profitability. Plus a bonus topic today as we discuss GPS dog collars and the use to manage our livestock guardian dogs on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. We're glad to have you along for the program here today. Grab your cup of coffee. Join me. I've got a fresh cup of steaming Cowpuncher coffee right here in front of me. Now, if you've been shopping around, maybe looking for a new brand of coffee, give it a try. Cowpunchercoffee.com is where you can go find more information. They've got several different varieties. Now, for me, I kind of like the dark roast, but Jim and Tricia Williams, it's a family-run operation there. They'll set you up with what'll work for you. Check it out again online at cowpunchercoffee.com. Well, we do indeed have a great program in store for you here today. Don't forget, later on in the show, meteorologist Don Day will be in for a look at our long-term weather, and of course the captain with his weekly edition of Tim's 2 Cents. Well, without further ado, let's jump into our subject here today. And joining us on the program is Karla Wilke, Beef Extension Specialist with the University of Nebraska. They're out of Scottsbluff, that's in western Nebraska, at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center. And Karla, glad to have you joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, the topic that we're covering here today, I think, is relevant on pretty much any kind of producer, no matter where you're at in the country. And we'll even get into probably some of our questions here talking about even the time of year you calve. But when we talk about getting that very elusive, I guess if you want to call it, second calf out of these cows, that's really important because we've invested an awful lot into getting these heifers to this point where they've got their first calf. But if we can't get to that second calf, the profitability really went down in that cow.
Right. And I think the worst part about the cost of depreciation is it's not something that we write a check for. So when we go back and look at what are our expenses and what are we making, we don't really see that because we didn't write it out. It's not a line item. But the depreciation cost from what you paid for that heifer to either develop her or buy her as a bred heifer, and then what you're going to get out of her having to sell her as a weigh up because she didn't come up with that second calf, that's a substantial loss to our operation in depreciation.
Mm-hmm. And I know this is something that we've talked about here on our show before because I feel it's one of the biggest losses in our cattle industry, and as us as ranchers, as you had said, we don't really write that check for a loss, but depreciation is a huge loss in our industry. In addition to part of that is just longevity. You know, an average, I think they say the average amount of calves in our herd in the U.S. herd is what, four, I think. Four calves?
It's 3 or 4, but that is incredible. Mm-hmm. That is way too low.
Yeah, it is. When it takes 3 to 4 calves before that cow finally is breaking even, that's huge. And that's a really big part of this whole deal when we're looking at this is if we can get to that second calf, that is projecting her into that era where she's going to be that cow that's going to have longevity.
Yeah, and I think what brings that average down so bad is this second calving. Trying to get this second calf out of those heifers is probably what brings that average down so bad.
Yeah, you're exactly right. A lot of times I've kind of worked through scenarios, even on my own operation, as well as visiting with other people, and say, let's start with 100 head of heifers. And what are we going to have in 5 years? How many are we going to have left? And it's quite shocking to realize that our biggest fallout is in that, 1 to 2 and then of course third year. Mm-hmm. So as you and I were talking before we went on air here, I was telling you about, even I had taken the approach, as a lot of ranchers do, that we're going to put some pressure on these heifers to perform, because I want them, as they grow older as a cow, that's kind of the conditions they're in, and that they need to perform as a young cow what the same conditions as these old cows are in. There's a little bit of caution, you would say, in that mindset, in that thinking.
Right. I hear that a lot too. She has to make it. I'm not going to baby her. But the issue with that is that particular heifer has a unique set of circumstances that her replacement heifer counterpart, who's trying to get bred with her very first baby, or the mature cow who's already made it into the herd, she has constrictions to her productivity that they don't have. So the replacement heifer trying to get bred for the first time has a requirement of nutrition for basal metabolism, growth, and reproduction. She has 3. The mature cow has basal metabolism needs. She has lactation, and she has reproduction. 3. This cow that we're talking about today, this young cow that's trying to get bred with her second baby, has a basal metabolism, growth, lactation, and then we're going to ask her to cycle and rebreed. So she has 4 major requirements to that same amount of nutrients that the other 2 are getting, and they're short one of the categories. And then we expect this girl to do what everybody else did on the same requirement, or on the same feed that we put out there. And then we get frustrated when she can't do it. So on the one hand is that we say we're not babying her, but you're sure not babying her, but you're also not even meeting her needs. So you're not setting her up for success. You're setting her up for failure and then blaming her because she couldn't do it. The other thing that we do sometimes that you and I had talked about that we need to be cognizant of is that when we're selecting for heifers, or we're selecting bulls that are going to be the sires of our replacement heifers, is the size of that calf, the milk production in those genetics. So if we are frustrated because we feel like our heifers aren't able to make it in our environment, we may need to back up and look at some things that we're doing before she's even getting bred the first time around, or before she even exists, to see if we are maybe making some selection decisions that are creating an animal that doesn't fit our environment. To me, my frustration sometimes is with this second calf heifer is you've already created this heifer. This heifer, you better meet needs on. If you feel like what she requires is too much for your operation, then we need to back up and look at what we're keeping for heifers, what we're selecting for bulls to make those replacement heifers, and make that change there. If you've already created her and you've already put all the money into developing her and breeding her the first time around, maybe we ought to just put a little effort into getting her bred the second time and then see where we are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's take a break here, Karla. When we come back, I want to continue to talk more about just looking at our genetics from an environmental standpoint and how we're making those selections. We're talking today with Karla Wilke, who is with the University of Nebraska, their beef extension, and talking about just what we need to do as ranchers when it comes to getting that second calf. That's a pretty important part, especially when it comes to the profitability of our own operations. We're going to continue on more with Karla when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today brought to you by K-Line Irrigation, a cost-effective adaptive irrigation solution designed specifically with the grass-based livestock producer in mind. To find out more, go to k-linena.com.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about the importance of probiotics for our horses and our equine health. But here's the thing, not all probiotics are created equal. Now, I've heard about this new Purina systemic supplement. It remains live and active, that's a key part, after not only the pelleting process, but throughout the digestive system, making it all the way into the hind gut. Now, Systemic was designed to support normal recovery after exercise and then that occasional gastrointestinal stress. Now, whether you're using a probiotic now or not, it's time now to look at using a live and active supplement from a name you trust. Check it out, the new Purina Systemic Probiotic. Well, as we continue on now, my guest today is Karla Wilke, who is with the University of Nebraska out of the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And we're talking about, just as ranchers, the process we're looking at as we try to get to that elusive second calf out of these young cows. And as we talked about in the last segment, just some of that, a lot of it has to do with understanding that there's a little bit being more asked of that heifer than there is our old cows. And Karla did a good job of explaining that element. Karla, I want to go a little bit further because one of the things that we continue to hear about, especially as I've had multiple interviews with other folks, is really selecting genetics based upon our environment. You talked about that a little bit ago in the last segment. I want to just expand a little bit more about that because it's not just, it's our bulls, and it's understanding us as ranchers need to understand literally the climate, the environment we're in, and what are we trying to do in this environment? Are we trying to raise a cow that is not conducive to this environment? And I think that is a big part of really from a profitability standpoint. We need to understand what our climate is, what our environment is, and then be looking at genetics that match that accordingly. Your thoughts?
Right. I think, part of our problem tends to be that we're always chasing a little heavier weaning weights and yearling weights. And maybe we get hung up on the name of a bull that's pretty popular or whatever. And so then we want that bull. I think that, we have fewer beef cattle in the U.S. than we ever had, but we're producing just as much beef, so we're doing more with less. And so I know that that's something that we have, we've done that through a lot of genetics and management, but we also need to be careful in that we don't end up creating a cow that has too big of a maintenance requirement, too big of a cow for the environment that we're in, has too much milk production for the environment that she's in. And then we begin to create an animal that has just more nutrient requirements than we have resources to provide for her. So there's always a balance.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, Karla, last year, in the last few years, we started keeping back our heifers. And it happened several years ago when prices were so low that we thought, my word, let's just start keeping some of these back because it wasn't really worth it to be selling them at the time. Since that time, and I run cows for different folks, and so I've got different genetics, different sets of cattle. Last year when we preg checked our heifers, it was interesting to see where the genetics played into not only the heifers that bred up, the first calf heifers, but also the rebreeds, the cows we're talking about now. And what you were talking about, the genetics, you could really see that come out. Some cows, some heifers that were actually pretty good sized, didn't breed up. Mm-hmm. And there's some of that, the maturity, the needs, as you said, the milking needs in various things. I thought that was interesting, and I actually got to see that firsthand, really, with their own deal. Not very many people have that ability. I want to get into the fact of looking at time of year of calving a little bit, because really, when you had talked to me, we were off air about some of the management things we need to be looking at. That can vary based upon when you calve. I'll let you expand on that a little bit more.
Absolutely. So if you calve in February, March, a lot of people do, or especially their heifers, they'll start those heifers kind of earlier than the cows. Then you've got a heifer that's going to reach peak lactation well before, in our area, at least out here in the West, before there's green grass for her to go to, because it might be June 1st or at least sometime in May. If you have maybe some cool season annuals or some crested wheatgrass, you might get out there, middle of May, but you got her going a good 2 months where she can be going downhill, losing weight because she is lactating, and maybe the hay that you're feeding plus a little bit of supplements just not quite enough to meet her lactation needs. Then she's pulled down so much that when she does go to green grass and she does go to the bulls, she just can't, her body just won't cycle because it's just too much, too low. Even though she may be gaining some weight, it's just too little, too late. On the other hand, it might be a little later calving in the spring, and she might be an April calver, and then you're going to be able to get away with, okay, maybe the hay and the supplement that I'm feeding her isn't quite meeting her needs. Maybe it's just a little below that, but she has a pretty short window there where she's then going to go to green grass, and she's going to be able to start on an increasing plane of nutrition, and hopefully, if she calved in a body condition score 6 on a 1 to 9 scale, which is what we really recommend for heifers, then even though she may have lost a little condition when she first went into lactation, she's still in a moderate condition. And so then, she starts on that increasing plane of nutrition. Her body's like, okay, yeah, we can cycle here. And so we have a better chance of getting her bred. So I'm not advocating, you can't calve out your heifers in February. I'm just saying, if that is your system, then you may want to evaluate what feed resources you can put together for that heifer, knowing that you're going to have a little longer time frame there before you can go to, a high quality forage with her, as opposed to someone who may calve and shortly thereafter go to green grass.
Yeah. And especially as you talked about in that first segment, if we're going with that mindset of, I'm going to treat her like my cows, and we're an early calver, that's kind of setting us up a little bit, as you had talked about. That's kind of what you were alluding to in the first segment as well.
Right. And the other thing that can happen to us is we can most years be on top of everything and it's all going to work well for us, or it does work well for us. And then we have a drought year and we can't go to grass, or going to grass becomes delayed. And what a lot of people, if I ask 15 producers, what takes more energy, lactation or pregnancy? All 15 of them would be like, duh, lactation. Okay. But then when I ask him from mid-gestation, when a cow just weaned her calf, say, and so now the calf that she's carrying is only second trimester and she doesn't have a lactation requirement. And then I go to peak lactation. Okay. When that baby's born or start lactating, that's almost a doubling of the energy requirement for that cow. That's the part they don't realize. And so then if they get delayed going to grass, which usually meets that need, then it's on them to come up with the feeds for that. And then all of a sudden things start falling apart and they don't understand quite what happened there. Well, that's what happened. That huge jump in lactation or energy requirement due to lactation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something really good to remember there too. My guest today is Karla Wilke with the University of Nebraska. And Karla, let's take a break here. And when we come back, I want to expand a little bit more and talk more about the subject you just referenced, and that was the increased plane of nutrition. I think that's a key point that we need to look at, especially when we are talking about rebreeding these heifers and getting to that second calf point in their lifespan. So stay with us. We're going to continue on here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Before we go, this segment brought to you by Inherent Select from Zoetis. Unlocking genetic potential starts with a complete picture of your commercial cow herd. You can learn how to get started with Inherent Select at beefgenetics.com/radio.
What if your commercial beef herd could be better than you thought possible? Genetic testing can help give you more confidence about what your herd is made of, and more importantly, what it can be. Inherit Select from Zoetis provides data-driven genetic insights to help you make more informed selection, breeding, and culling decisions about your cows and heifers. The journey from genetic potential to reality begins with Inherit Select. Ask a genetics rep how to save on testing with our whole herd promotion. Go to beefgenetics.com/radio.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Karla Wilke with the University of Nebraska out of the Panhandle Research and Extension Center, their beef extension specialist. And Karla, as I said before we went to break in the last segment, I wanted to revisit that topic you had talked about of the increasing plane of nutrition. When we talk about rebreed, and it's not just in these young heifers that we're trying to get that second calf out of, or I guess they're not heifers, but these young cows to get that second calf out of, it's really with any cow out there, that increasing plane of nutrition, that is kind of a key point in some of this. That's where we're talking about in terms of that management, because that's what's going to prompt physically that cow body to cycle.
Right. And so there's been some research that has showed that if those cows are in the 5-6 body condition on a 1 to 9 scale, going on that increasing plane of nutrition doesn't have as much impact as it does if they're a little thinner. And so one thing that tells us is if we come through a horrible winter, and we weren't expecting some of the things that we ran into 2 winters ago, we had horrible blizzards and behind a drought in western Nebraska and eastern Colorado, and some cows got pretty thin. And so we can, if we can get them on an increasing plane of nutrition right before breeding and going into the first part of breeding, there's research shows that we can increase conception rates, decrease that postpartum interval. So we can manipulate those thinner cows a little bit by doing that increasing plane of nutrition. With that second calf heifer, the problem can be that we let her get down too far. She just can't recover enough to do that because she also has that growth requirement. But all is not lost if we come through the winter with some mature cows a little thinner than we're comfortable with. We have that opportunity after calving to increase that plane of nutrition and get them up there.
Yeah. And not to keep beating the same subject here, but again, some of this depends on when you calve. For you and I, as we were talking, we're a little bit later calvers, some folks earlier calvers. If you're a February heifer calver, then it's going to require the point of knowing where that nutritional requirements are, because the mindset, as we talked about in the very first segment, we'll kind of end on that a little bit, is just going into this idea of treating our 2-year-olds coming 3s like our old range cows. That could get us into a lot of trouble.
It can. We can be pretty disappointed when we preg check those, and that can be a pretty big financial hit, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Karla, before we head out here today, I want to give you an opportunity for some final comments regarding our subject that we've been talking about, and that is this elusive second calf and some of the things that you found as you're talking and dealing with producers. Some final comments.
So to summarize or to reiterate, selection of that heifer should begin before she's born, before the bull that you intend to sire those heifers with is purchased. And we need to be careful and watching those EPDs on mature size milk production in this heifer to make sure that what we develop as a heifer will actually match the environment that we have for her. Number 2 is that once we have her on the ground and we've committed to her and we bred her as a first calf heifer, then we probably owe it to her to feed her enough to meet her needs, for her to get that second calf, or make sure at least that we are trying to meet her needs and not holding her back. She is a little harder than the replacement heifer and the mature cow because she also she has growth and lactation as a requirement, whereas the other two will either have only growth or only lactation. And so that is important. And depreciation costs are a very real cost, even though we don't write checks for them. And so we need to be very cognizant of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. To go back one more thing, you had just hit something there that I thought was interesting, was you were talking about that she is different than even that developing heifer. That lactating part, and you had mentioned that before, that's a big deal.
Yeah. Lactation is huge. It's a huge energy drain, but growth is a big nutrient drain as well. And so where the replacement heifer doesn't have lactation, she just has growth, and the mature cow just has lactation, not growth. That second calf heifer or young cow is a unique animal on your operation. She has completely different requirements and obstacles to overcome that the other two do not.
Yeah. All right. Well, Karla, I appreciate you taking the time to join us on this. I think it is a part of all of our operations. You hit on some very key points that I think sometimes we don't fully think through, especially when we talk about the longevity in our cattle. As we were talking, if we can just get one more calf than the average out of our cattle, out of our average herd, that sets our entire operation up to be extremely more profitable than the average herd in the country. And that really is, at the end of the day, that's kind of what we're striving for, is profitability. Don't you think?
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Karla, thanks for joining us here today on the program.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. And again, my guest today, Karla Wilke, Beef Extension Specialist with the University of Nebraska. Now, she's based there in western Nebraska in Scottsbluff area at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center. Appreciate her joining us on our program today. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about GPS technology being used in the management of our guardian dogs. Have you thought about that? Well, stay with us. We're going to talk about it when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and had excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show as we continue on now our program here today. I know in some ranching operations, there's consideration in looking at ways that we can diversify the type of enterprise mixes that we have on our places. And oftentimes it involves looking at types of species that in many places might need or could be in the need of guardian dogs. Different enterprises, things like sheep, goats, chickens, turkeys, as I've heard about guys putting chickens out at their watering tanks in hopes of eliminating and cutting down on parasite control in their livestock. But livestock guardian dogs are often the most economical means of providing that type of protection. So then that leads us to, how do we manage these guardian dogs? Because that's a whole nother element. A lot of times we're looking at adding an enterprise mix, not at a volume where we can just stick somebody out there as a herder and watching over that. So if we have that ability to manage these guardian dogs in a means that is economical and efficient, how do we do that? So that leads us to the use of GPS technology that allows us to manage our guardian dogs. And today joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show is Ken Bazzadola with Spot On GPS Fence, as well as Bill Costanzo, who is with Texas A&M. Guys, thanks for joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Great to be here. Glad to be here.
Well, Ken, let's go with you first, because when we start talking about GPS technology, boy, we've come a long ways from what we've seen in our industry of basically in-ground type of fence control for yard dogs to now what we're talking about with GPS technology in this. And so let's talk about where we've come in the last 5 to 10 years with what we've got today.
Yeah, we really have come a long way with the GPS technology. And as you know, the market the options were quite limited back 5, 10 years ago, limited to either a physical fence or a buried wire fence. And so those were costly, labor intensive, and required maintenance as well. With the introduction of GPS technology, our inventor and founder found a way to contain a dog using GPS. And so with that was about 5 years ago when we launched our first generation product, but the work to design the GPS system started almost 9 years ago.
Okay. Let's physically talk about the components, and then we'll get into, Bill, I'll probably bring you in because I know you're the expert on some of this, looking at where we're using this in protection of livestock. So I'll bring you in on that. But Ken, I want to go to you right now, and let's physically talk about these components, because that's the thing. Then we can branch out into how can be used from a ranching management standpoint on our guardian dogs.
Yeah, the first thing about it is that there's a collar that the dog wears, and it's a completely self-contained system. So the collar includes a GPS receiver. It includes a cellular transceiver so that it can communicate with a cell tower, as well as a mobile app that allows you to keep track of the dog as well as configure the collar. And that's the system. Inside of the collar, there's also electronics that allow it to control and know where the position of the collar is and give feedback both in terms of tones as well as static correction if the dog does enter or comes close to the boundary. We use 4 GPS satellite constellations that are flying overhead. And the main purpose of that is the more satellites that you can connect to, the more accurate the system is. GPS, sometimes people are confused. GPS is actually a free service available all over the world. And so the system will work with or without a cell plan or with cell reception because it is self-contained and the dog is able to stay inside that area. Now, the way you train your dog is you work on training the dog to recognize the boundary, starting with the tones. And as you train the dog around the boundary, they're really taught to honor the boundary based on the tone. The static correction comes in as the next step of there's a consequence for crossing the boundary. And so the dog starts to understand that. But really, they're just trained to respond to the tones if they're properly trained. Some of the benefits of that is that really keeping the dog inside the boundary protects the dog from if you're near the highway or things like that. But also we've talked to producers and they could have the adjacent property. There could be traps for predators. There could be other hazards. And so it's really important for them to keep the dog inside of the boundary as well. Mm-hmm. Talking about the cellular subscription, it's an optional subscription. And assuming that you have cell coverage, that allows you to now not only contain the dog, but keep tabs on the dog. It sends a location of where the dog is every 20 minutes. And if the dog does leave the boundary, the tracking turns on and you get a notification and you're able to locate the dog. Mm-hmm. If the dog comes back and returns on its own, you'll also get a notification and you're good to go. But the nice thing is that if your dog does leave, you can go and find that dog.
Okay. Interesting. So, Bill, I want to go to you now. I know working with you at Texas A&M, let's talk about what you have found. I know you're working on this in terms of the relationship with livestock guardian dogs. What are you finding in this?
So we've had a multi-year bonding project going on since 2019 with livestock guardian dogs. And one of the big problems with livestock guardian dogs is, a lot of producers know is that they roam. Okay, because these dogs were developed in Europe over thousands of years and they didn't have fencing. They traveled with herders from summer to winter pastures. And so the dogs didn't develop a respect as they were bred for fencing because there just wasn't fencing there. So when we brought the dogs over to the U.S., roaming became a major issue. And so there were several studies done in the mid and late 80s that looked at, so a producer buys a dog. How long is that dog, staying on the property and effectively working for them? And so those studies found that after 6 years, about 48% of the dogs were no longer there or working on the ranches. And of that 48%, 8%, about 57% had died, and they died because they left the property for some reason, and so that's a big cost for producers to constantly be replacing dogs that are not aging out and needing to be retired. So we use dogs in Texas a little bit differently than y'all do up in Wyoming, where you've got, similar to what Europe had, you have summer and winter pastures and you're moving dogs around without fencing. Everything here is contained in a fence. Now, I mean, those pastures may be small or they may be very large, up to, 1,500, 2,000 acres in far west Texas. Mm-hmm. But there's still a need for the dogs to stay where we place them, because as Ken said, neighbors may be trapping or snaring or setting out M44s. And so, producers need to keep their dogs alive and keep them where they put them. So the use of technology like Spot On has allowed us to teach dogs respect for fencing, permanent fencing, and keep them where we need them to be. Mm-hmm. And so we've been using the system for about a year and a half now, and it's worked really well to either retrain dogs that were problem dogs because they were roaming, or, start off with a pup and teach them respect from an early age with this system. And so it's been very effective for us. We've taken dogs that were roaming a lot. I mean, multiple times a week and traveling 4 or 5 miles away, and put them into an invisible fence system and stop those dogs for 9 months straight from even leaving at all. Mm-hmm. So we're continuing to do some research on that, but so far it's been very successful using a system like this.
Mm-hmm. Bill, one of the things I think about, and I brought this up in our intro, is for a lot of ranchers, and I'm kind of in this boat myself, I wouldn't mind looking at some diversification. We've had sheep on our place here, but that's been at a high volume of sheep, and those have come with a herder that can watch, not only the sheep but also maintaining control on the guardian dogs. But when we start looking at a lower volume, say under 1,000 head of animals in sheep or goats in that case, and we start looking at either a smaller volume or a completely different species, this is what I was looking at. This was what kind of perked my interest a little bit in this, where we can, from an economical sense, I can't afford to bring in somebody to just be out there guarding 300-400 head. And so from your guys' standpoint, what's the type of guard dogs that you've been working on and the species that you guys have been working with in this?
Okay, so we've tested quite a few different breeds so far to date. I normally have one straight bred breed in the project each time, and then a crossbreed set. So we've looked at Maremas, we've looked at Great Pyrenees, Akbash, Commodores. I currently have some Crocochans in the mix, Anatolian Shepherds. And then we've had mixes of dogs too. We've had Akbash Pyrenees, we've had Akbash Pyrenees, Anatolian Shepherds. And so, some of the dogs do have tendencies in the breeds. Mm-hmm. And so that does affect, how well they stay with the herd, whether they want to be a, kind of a close in dog that's tight with the herd all the time, or they want to be, farther out on the perimeter. And so some of those breeds, like, and again, this is just a tendency. This isn't, we haven't tested 500 Anatolian Shepherds, for instance, but in the dogs that we have tested, for instance, Anatolian Shepherds tend to be more of a perimeter dog. And so, those are dogs that we've run back through after they've gone through the project and gotten out of the bonding portion of it, but then they needed to be retrained because maybe they were roaming some or just patrolling outside their pastures more than what we wanted, because there is a difference between roaming and patrolling. Mm-hmm. And that's the one nice thing with the Spot On system is we don't have to run a separate tracking collar on the dogs. It has the GPS tracker built into it, and you get an instant notification on your phone. I mean, I would say it's usually generally within seconds that the dog's out, and then it's constantly tracking the dog until either you go and get it and bring it back, or, hopefully it returns on its own. So that's really the nice thing about the Spot On system is being able to have that tracking ability if that's something that you need or that you want, with your guardian dog.
Mm-hmm. Ken, I want to go back to you real quick. And I know you've already answered some of the kind of the frequently asked questions that people would want to know about in regards to cell service and things like that. Let's talk. There's really not a size or a scope. I mean, we're really looking at it can be pretty much used in any kind of size or scope of operation, really, right? Am I reading that correctly?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, as a consumer product, it's down to half an acre, but there's really no upper limit to the size of the fence. It's as large as you can walk it or draw it. You can either draw it on using the app or you can walk the perimeter.
So, which when we're talking about ranching operations, like Bill was saying, I mean, we're talking about a lot bigger than somebody's half-acre yard. I mean, we're talking a pretty good-sized operation, which are going to be most of these. Just a couple things, waterproof. I mean, because these dogs, they run these through the ringer. So, I mean, are these things going to stay together, or are we going to be replacing these things? Are they going to keep functioning here?
Yeah, they are waterproof. They're waterproof to IP67 standard. And so the dog can either go in a pond or in a cooling trough. It's totally fine, or in the rain, of course.
Mm-hmm. And then, like Bill has said, for a lot of operations, it's probably not just one dog. We could be having a couple different types of dogs. I know a lot of places that run different breeds of dogs, mainly because one's more of a companion with the herd, one's more of a perimeter guard dog. So can we run multiple dogs in these?
You can run multiple dogs and still utilize the app. So it would be one collar per dog. Like I said, they're totally self-contained. So you add one dog, and then you can use the fences that you've already created and just activate them on that collar.
Okay. Well, guys, thanks again for joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Bill, I want to go to you with one final comment, and then Ken, we'll let you wrap things up where folks can get more information. So, Bill, just some final comments from you.
Yeah, one nice thing about the spot on system is the ability to make exclusion zones. If you have a barn or a shop, or your headquarters is in the middle of your pasture, you can set up a boundary around that and keep the dogs out, which is really nice for guardian dogs, especially young dogs that tend to want to come up to the headquarters and seek out some human contact once in a while. But yeah, it's been a really great system for us, and looking forward to using it some more.
Ken, if folks are interested in find out more information, where do they go to do that?
They can go to spotonfence.com.
You bet. Okay, guys, I appreciate you joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thank you.
You bet. And again, that was Ken Basadola with Spot On GPS Fence, and Bill Costanzo with Texas A&M. Some interesting information sharing with us today about the use of GPS technology in our dog collars. And if you're somebody like me that's considering diversifying your operation, bringing in some species that would need guardian dogs, this might be something to be looking at. Or maybe you're already that operation that has species that need those and have guard dogs, and you're wanting to keep them doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're a big investment, and so are the species and the animals that they're protecting as well. So something to look at here. And like Ken was saying, if you want to find out more information about their products, you can go to their website at spotonfence.com. By the way, we do have a code here if you'd like to use it, because it'll give you $125 off of a product at Spot On Fence. You can go to their website there. The code you will want to use for listeners here, the Working Ranch Radio Show, is LGD125. Again, that code is LGD125, and also we'll put that in our show notes as well. Well, stay with us. Coming up after the break, the Captain Tim O'Byrne is standing by for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents, and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather.
Looking for the perfect gift for a gardener or weather enthusiast? Introducing the Tropo, a precision rain gauge that has revolutionized both reliability and convenience. Expertly engineered by meteorologists, the Tropo gauge boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Seeing lots of green grass on your responses to our Friday post, what's going on out there in cow country today on Facebook. and things are looking pretty good. Some people got a little bit too much moisture there, but it'll work itself out one of these days. Hey, Justin, here's a kind of a yellow flag on the freeway of the beef industry here. See, this is U.S. Department of Agriculture today announced it is taking several additional actions to ensure the health and viability of the nation's livestock and poultry. In the 2 months since the initial detection of H5N1, that's the bird flu, in dairy cattle, and you had a great program on that here about 3 episodes back, so folks check it out on podcast. USDA has worked quickly and in concert with its federal and state partners to better understand the virus and contain the disease, and remains committed to seeking additional ways to collect the data needed to better understand and mitigate the risk created by this outbreak. Now get this, folks, USDA is adding an additional $824 million in emergency funding from the Commodity Credit Corporation, CCC, to bolster these efforts, and is launching a new voluntary H5N1 dairy herd status program to give dairy producers more options to monitor the health of their herds and move cows more quickly, while providing ongoing testing and expanding USDA's understanding of the disease. Justin, we need to drill down into that. That's a big chunk of change. So I want to know anytime I see anything, well, these days, anytime I see anything over $1 million, I want instant accountability for that. But this is a large chunk of money. So let's dig into that. Have a great week, everybody. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain. And yeah, boy, that is an awful lot of money on that with that. And I don't know, there's probably some real mixed reviews or mixed feelings on that. Definitely don't want to see our fellow dairy producers in the livestock industry being hurt, by no means, and want to see some assistance and help to them. But at the same time, this is an awful lot of money, and there's nothing free in our world, as we're much seeing now with where interest rates have been after what we saw happening during the pandemic. Nevertheless, it is something to be looking at. And we know, too, that with the idea of what can be identified or figured out in the dairy industry, no doubt for us in the beef industry, hopefully it will carry over in terms of some of that information they find out in regard to this bird flu. Now, also, folks, the captain mentioned about the episode that we did here on the Working Ranch Radio Show in regards to the bird flu outbreak, and what if at that point in time, what if it was in the beef industry? I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that show. It was episode 166 that aired the first part of May. Well, we're going to switch subject here just a little bit, as we always do, and meteorologist Don Day is standing by. And Don, I was just pulled up here as we were chatting before we went on air here, the drought monitor map, looking at the last week versus the current one that we have. Not a lot of change in our drought monitor map. I know we're going to see some moisture here this weekend for areas that have been a little bit dry, but as we start looking at the next 7 to 10 days out, we are seeing things heat up more in the west, cooler in the Midwest.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to see a little bit of a reversal. For most of the month of May, the nation's midsection, the Central Plains, the east was pretty warm, especially across the Southern Plains and parts of the central and southern areas of the Corn Belt, while the west was a little bit cooler than average. But what's going to be taking place is it's going to be getting a little cooler in those areas that were warmer, and the areas that were a bit cooler are going to be heating up. We're going to have some real hot temperatures in California, Las Vegas, up into the Pacific Northwest. There's going to be a lot of heat building into places like the desert Southwest as well, into Arizona, a lot of triple-digit temperatures. But it's June. It's the time of year we start to see that. But for the Midwest Corn Belt, cool and wet. There's still some areas that need some dry soils, and some parts of the Midwest are pretty wet. And when you do look at the drought monitor, one thing that really shows up is that with only a few minor exceptions, if you look at the Midwest and Corn Belt, pretty much drought-free. There's nobody that's even in any drought status whatsoever. The worst drought conditions continue to be in central and western Kansas, New Mexico, parts of Arizona, far west Texas, some patchy dryness in the northern Rockies and northern Plains, but really nothing too bad.
Yeah, which is a little bit different than really what we had seen the last couple of years. So that's significant. And definitely the folks that are drier probably don't think it's quite significant, but at the same time.
That is really true. That's one thing we've seen this spring is it's been pockets. It's been pockets of wet and pockets of dry. So as you sometimes read in those disclaimers on packages or things you buy, results may vary.
Yeah, for sure. So as we are at this weekend, we are seeing some moisture developing or in parts of the west, mainly east of the Continental Divide area, and that's going to be moving through here as we're speaking now, in addition to maybe early on in this coming week. That weather pattern, though, where we're seeing that moisture coming up from the south, are we going to continue to see that as we go through the month of June?
Well, I think what we're going to see in the month of June is, compared to what it was like in May for many areas that were really wet, it is going to be drying out some. Case in point, I think what we're going to see after a very wet late April and May in places across the northern plains, like Montana, parts of northern Wyoming, the Dakotas, it's going to be a little bit drier up there, and there's going to be a little bit more of a southward shift to the heavier moisture. I do see some help on the way for some of the winter wheat country of Kansas, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, southeastern Colorado. They've got some chances here over the next week to 10 days to get some needed moisture, and we'll throw in eastern New Mexico into that as well, and parts of Texas that are dry. Mm-hmm. So we are seeing some changes from where we've been over the last month and a half as we are starting to get into an early summer pattern. But one thing we are seeing, Justin, is that at least here for another week or so, there'll be parts of the U.S. that maybe act more like spring than summer.
All right. So one of the things we talked about a bit as well before we went on air was the fact that we've really seen some pretty significant severe weather into the South, Midwest, Corn Belt area, Southeast area. And you say that's going to start to maybe scale back just a little bit.
Yeah, the pattern that was so persistent that led to the severe weather is changing. And part of this is that reversal in temperatures we talked about. When it's cool in the west in the spring and warm in the east in the spring, that's just a recipe for disaster. That is just going to lead to a lot of severe thunderstorms, tornado outbreaks, just like what we saw. But that pattern's, at least in the short term, at least here over the next week to 10 days, is going to reverse. And if you look at where we've been so far, tallying the number of reported tornadoes, we're on the very high end compared to other years going back into the 1950s. So the tornado count is extremely high this year, but the pattern responsible for that, at least for now, is going to change a bit. It won't eliminate severe weather. There will still be some. There's always going to be severe weather somewhere in June, but we're going to see a little bit of a scaling back of the intensity and how widespread it's been over the last 6 weeks. That is going to pull back a bit.
And so then my question would be, it's scaling back in the areas that had been fairly significant, but we are starting to see that summer type weather cycle where we're like up in our part of the country, those afternoon, evening weather or thunderstorms. So would you say that if we're going to see severe weather, more than likely it's going to maybe be in some of that type of activity that's going to happen?
Exactly. And it's going to be where the warm meets the cold, and that's going to be further west this time. So some of the western high plains from the Texas, Oklahoma panhandles through the eastern slopes of the Rockies, you're going to start to see more in the way of severe warnings, severe thunderstorms. Doesn't necessarily mean tornado activity, but it does mean the thunderstorms that produce the wind and the hail, those types of things. We will see that shift further west as compared to where it's been in the middle of the U.S. for the last month and a half.
All right, Don, well, appreciate the update here. It's always helpful, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.
And you can catch meteorologist Don Day each and every morning on his daily video podcast by going to dayweather.com. By the way, if you're looking at weather station or rain gauge, why don't you check his website out for that as well. Stay with us. When we come back, I'll tell you what's in store for next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, the Livestock Marketing Association has really been active here in the last year in bringing producers to the table and talking about producer profitability. We're going to find out what that is all about. As newly elected president of the LMA will be joining us, Mike Van Manen will be on to talk about producer profitability, what they have in mind with that, and the workshops that they've been hosting. Join us on the Working Ranch Radio Show next week. Now, before we head out here today, do you have your summer issue of Working Ranch magazine? If you don't, it's pretty easy to get subscribed. You can go to workingranchmag.com and start your subscription, but packed full of great articles again in this issue. I'll tell you, there's one in there on turning tires into tanks. We do that here. They're kind of indestructible. Of course, we have pretty good access as close as we are to the big coal mines here in Wyoming, but check it out. Loretta Sorensen writes that article on page 30. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you'd like to get a hold of me, it's pretty simple. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks to our sponsors today, K-Line Irrigation, Inherent Select from Zoetis, the American Gelbvieh Association, and Cowpuncher Coffee. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.